My guest today is Peter Frankopan. Peter is a professor of global history at Oxford University, and I'm going to ask him what he thinks the future of the Silk Roads might look like in a post-COVID world.
Of course, as a very boring historian, I can tell you that there's no such thing as Silk Roads. This is an abstract term for an abstract series of connections. But broadly speaking, what I mean that to be is the area between the Mediterranean going eastwards as far as the Pacific. And in today's world, when we hear the word Silk Roads, that tends to mean Chinese-led Belt and Road Initiative. The world I look in is not a simple one. So when we talk about Silk Roads, if you talk about India's relationship with Iran, for example, investments into Chahabar, into things like energy, this means something very different to the Belt and Road Initiative. So the first point, I suppose, is that this is a region that is on the move, no matter which lens you use to look at it, whether from Moscow, whether from Delhi, whether from Beijing, whether from Kuala Lumpur. It also is different depending if you're looking top down from policy level or from bottom up. And one of the things about COVID and the pandemic is that the people it disproportionately affects, these dislocations, like with warfare, are the people at the bottom of society. And again, there are different answers and different responses to those kinds of questions. So for example, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf is a key part of any kind of Silk Road network connections because of its geography, but also the resources and the energy, in particular the fossil fuels. Saudi Arabia has the second largest immigrant population in the world after the United States. And so changes to these countries, changes to their economic models, changes their political structures, changes their distribution of society, their tolerances towards different religions, ethnicities, and so on. It's all up in the air. And what the bottom line is that COVID is going to accelerate some of those changes and presumably hold back some others.
As COVID creates this new world for us, what are the important trends that you are seeing in these geographies?
COVID, has caused huge dislocation, and here we are talking in the early summer of 2020. It's very hard to know when we look back on this in a few years' time how things develop in the future. But I think what these last few months have done is to put a pause and give a chance to reflect on what some of the realities coming towards us are. Some of those are to do with pandemic and the economic upheaval that has happened. But some is, as I said, these are trends that have been going. But I suppose when we think about the classical Silk Road, when people drift to think about Samarkand and Kabul and Merv in their sort of glory days, I suppose the first thing that we tend to think about is that these were cosmopolitan centers that were welcoming to people of different faiths, different aptitudes, different skin colors, different languages, because broadly speaking, it doesn't always quite work out, but broadly speaking, places that are cosmopolitan tend to be more tolerant, tend to be more open, tend to be more receptive. And for all sorts of reasons, over the course of the last, 5, maybe 10 years, a lot of states around the world have started to become less and less tolerant in the absence of warfare. We have chosen to start to decouple. We've chosen to become unsettled by each other's economic success. And that's rather unusual. Normally, these things, they come as a result of dislocation, but we're choosing to head off the cliff. So one of the questions I think about this region as a whole is what decisions can and should be made that will dampen some of these down? What are the roles of really important powers and places like Russia, like Iran, like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, like the Emirates, like Pakistan, like India, like Indonesia, like Philippines, big populations, big resources, and their futures in front of them? What role will there be in multilateral organizations, multilateral alliances? And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing bubbling under the surface right now. And one of the things that's interesting about the Silk Roads is that over the past, they tend to rise and they tend to fall in parallel. It's like a wave. But generally, dislocation and collapse of one trading market tends to magnify through into affect other ones too. So you can win-win in a global situation, but you can also lose-lose.
If there were leaders who wanted to learn from history, what would you say to them they should be learning from the history of the Silk Roads?
Human society and history tends to pick up on 3 or 4 different topics that affect us all. One is disease. It's part of our global history. One is on climate. One is natural resources or resources that are valuable. And one is on demographics. So right now, China sits in the middle of all of those kinds of questions. So too, to some extent, does India. So too, to some extent, does Russia. So too, to some extent, does Iran, Saudi, all these big, powerful states that are potentially volatile. So The thing I'm watching now is how these pieces of the jigsaw puzzle slot together. So right now, even before COVID, but accelerated through COVID, Russia's strategic alliance and common interests with China have become probably too close from a Russian perspective because there's no other options available. Right now, India is having to choose very carefully how it plays cards against China right now with Ladakh, but also India's been very reluctant to adopt the United States as its key strategic partner. The main arms supplier to India is still Russia, and ideas about the Asia Pacific and the balance of China is one that is very sensitively handled in most of these countries, where the key is always to find options. That is the kind of, I suppose, the Silk Roads in a nutshell. You want to have as many options as possible because you want to have as many ability to play your cards in the way that you want. And when things become difficult is either when you have no choice or other people force you to play your cards. And that, I think, is one of the fracture points that was coming towards us before COVID. And this has just made it all worse.